Ok. Bien, bonjour à tous, Laure Chaudet de l'Admical. Merci de nous avoir rejoints pour ce webinaire organisé par notre partenaire, le CECP. Nous suivons depuis plus d'un an l'évolution du projet sur le reporting international des actions de mécénat des entreprises. La question du reporting à l'international est importante pour les entreprises qui ont des filiales à l'étranger, car il faut trouver un langage commun et s'assurer qu'on parle des mêmes choses quand on parle des actions de philanthropie ou de mécénat, notamment au niveau des règles et des règles du don et du vocabulaire qui peuvent varier grandement d'un pays à l'autre. Donc c'est pourquoi le CECP a mis en place des outils d'aide au reporting qui constituent des repères, tant d'un point de vue juridique et fiscal que culturel, dont les enjeux sont évidemment la traçabilité de ces actions de mécénat et une possibilité de comparer ces actions avec d'autres entreprises. Donc le CECP a mis en place un guide pratique, Global Guide to What Counts, et un outil de benchmarking en ligne que va nous présenter Carmen du CECP.
So thank you so much, Laure, and I'm very happy to be on the webinar today to share some information about our global guide and how we think it can serve your company around reporting and benchmarking of your international contributions. So just a little bit of housekeeping to begin. Our agenda is we want to go through our project motivation behind the global guide, a little bit about the actual report that produces the criteria. The bulk of the presentation will be on the criteria themselves, what's different and what's the same. We're going to present a little bit about our international giving data, and then we're available to answer any questions that anyone on the call may have. So just to note that we are recording, and the video is going to be available on CECP's YouTube channel. And a reminder of our deadline for the Global Guide study on 2012 contributions, which is July 15th. So we want to thank Admical, and in particular Laure, for the long partnership together with CECP. We appreciate the collaboration and also sharing best practices beyond the reporting and the Global Guide, but just kind of understanding the organizations. And we think that our missions are very aligned in helping companies produce increased benefits for the company around their philanthropy, but also their larger corporate responsibility programs. So thank you very much for that. And a little bit about CECP, just to provide the context for our measurement work. We have CEO members that meet once a year at our Board of Boards, annual gatherings of members, an Excellence Award, thought leadership around our research. You probably notice a lot of parallels with Admical's work. So we're an organization with similar mission and program offerings to companies here in the U.S. Our corporate giving standard has been active since 2002. It's the biggest survey in the United States, with over last year 120 billion U.S. was reported to our survey, and 240 companies participated. That's a typo. It's actually 60 from the Fortune 100. Representing the largest companies here, and we're using that to produce giving in numbers. And obviously, as I mentioned from the outset, the purpose of the Global Guide and all of our benchmarking work is to help companies access the data set for benchmarking, comparison, analysis, and to see where the company stands in order to pursue improvement for programs. So before we dive into the Global Guide and reporting, we just want to touch first that we understand that international giving is extremely complicated, and companies invest a huge amount of resources into developing their international giving programs, whether it is vetting NGOs, dealing with various vendors, intermediaries, just dealing with cross-company communication can be quite challenging. And we just want to acknowledge and address the fact that reporting, we understand, is only one piece of a larger puzzle that a company is tackling when they seek to give abroad. And the way that we address it is through peer-to-peer learning. Outside of our reporting and measurement guidance, which is at our summit once a year, this year we talked about the process of global giving in a session called Global Giving Structures. And so this is just to touch on the fact that we understand that the bigger picture of this issue goes far beyond reporting and connects to a multitude of other resources that a company invests in order to expand its philanthropy footprint to other countries. But really what the Global Guide is addressing is only one piece of that, which is to define what counts and to produce reporting and benchmarking tools for companies. So this is also, I should mention, on a global basis. So this is in addition to any work that you could be doing domestically with Admical and others to report giving within France. And it's to be an expansion of that, in addition to that, in order to allow you to benchmark against multinational peers and others from your industry that might be headquartered abroad. And the goal here, of course, is reporting. And we want to talk a bit about the motivation by using an analogy. A phrase we use in the US all the time is comparing apples to apples. I think in French there's not an equivalent phrase except to say comparer à ce qui est comparable. And we want to use this analogy because we think it's quite important to think about why a standard can help advance the industry, advance the movement, and help companies improve their reporting. So we think about the fact that in order to have useful benchmarking, companies need to have a common understanding, a common definition for benchmarking. And as philanthropy and corporate contributions become closer to a business function and part of the business, they need to be treated as such and use similar definitions. So we'd ask everybody to picture an apple in your head and then compare here. Do any of these apples exactly match the picture you had? I would guess most likely not. However, you are definitely able to identify among these 9 images which are also apples and which are not. And we think that's important because although there are different flavors, there's this common understanding, a common sense of what is the biological definition of this particular fruit, and you can identify where you can compare and where you cannot compare. So if we want to compare total giving, how do we achieve that same result of having a common understanding and a common baseline? If you're looking at these numbers of a company's total annual giving, is there a way to distinguish and understand that each company is including within their total the same type of organization, the same type of contribution? And the way that we think that we can advance that movement is to have a common standard so that when any stakeholder, whether internal to the company or external to the company, sees a total giving number, they can say that, yes, they're confident in what that includes. They understand the definition. They know among those other companies' total giving numbers who they can compare against. So in order to achieve that and to help this standard move forward, CECP produced these two reports. On the left is very short. It's just the criteria themselves. So it's just a fold-out. It's 6 pages, extremely short. And then on the right, we have the more in-depth research. This is for the inquiring mind that seeks to find full information on how we created the standard and the research behind it. I wanted to touch just quickly on the history so that it's understood that a significant investment went into creating these very concise and short criteria to define included recipients. The relationship actually was done in partnership with Deloitte. They were our pro bono consultant, and they brought their international tax team to conduct the research to create the criteria. And you'll see that the research was paired with a lot of practitioner engagement. So we reached out to the companies that would apply the standard for their feedback and input to define it and make it useful. The advisory comment period is an example of that. The public comment period is an example of that. And you can see at the bottom a bit more about the research, the 17 countries that CECP studied in order to produce the criteria and the research that created the standard. These are the countries with the highest concentration of Global 500 firms. So what do we mean when we say defining what counts? This is the current standard CECP uses in our research, and we ask companies to report giving to 501c3s, which is the registered charity here in the United States, and abroad to find the equivalent of a registered charity. And that's the standard, the baseline, or the definition that we use to produce giving in numbers. And the Global Guide allows us to use 3 criteria, which takes a step away from pointing to any domestic regulation. And we assume that in other efforts, any other survey or gathering of information, companies have a general sense of reporting against what is recognized as a charity domestically. So now we're going to go in more detail on the criteria, and we'd ask companies to frame your thinking in two ways. First is, how does this criteria compare or align with policies and procedures you already have in place? It could be that you feel confident that your entire portfolio fits the criteria, or you can be able to identify that certain policies and procedures might allow some in and some out that do not qualify. And the second is, what fields in your reporting system reflect this type of information? So it could be that within the way your company is tracking all your grantees or donees or all NGO partners, you're keeping an institutional type, and you're keeping a program area type that would allow you to track and find this information and whether or not they qualify by the Global Guide criteria. And here they are. There's 3 criteria: that the recipient is organized, that they have a charitable purpose, and that they do not distribute profits. And the plus sign between each of these criteria is very important because they must meet all 3 in order to qualify. A deeper look at that first criteria on being formally organized shows that this is just to prove that the institution has organizational identity. For most companies, this is a very easy criteria to be sure that you are meeting, because in order to provide the funds or the finance, you need to have this. It's a very basic part of any vetting process. This is the criteria, though, where we do exclude any contributions to individuals as well as any contributions to governments. The one exception here is schools. We do allow government-run or public schools to be included in total contributions, but that's kind of the extent of what's covered here in this first criteria. The reason governments are excluded is that we found from practitioners that while it was a practice that existed, in our pilot we found that 1/3 of companies are giving to government recipients in their contributions budgets, but there was not significant enough momentum nor clearly defined criteria to determine how we could say that governments are included across the board. So I'm jumping to the 3rd criteria because the 2nd criteria is a bit more in-depth. The 3rd criteria is actually that the institution must never distribute profits. The emphasis here is on distribution. This criteria should not be considered a limitation on an NGO's commercial activity to produce, or unique ways to produce revenue. But we're trying to distinguish between commercial motives and non-commercial motives. So when is an institution in business for commercial purposes or the production of profit in order to financially enhance individuals, owners, members, founders, investors? And that's how we're making this distinction. Clearly, it's a problem if we do not have this distinction, because there are businesses, such as, let's say, a housing development company, which could attempt to say that they're in this category because they have a charitable purpose. But the real idea is that we need to separate those that may, at the surface, have a charitable purpose, but really be in existence in order to produce a commercial or profitable outcome. Once again, we did hear from companies that they do have, primarily through the social enterprise community of businesses, some partners in their charitable contributions portfolio which do have a commercial structure or be registered as a business. And we collect this data in a separate question in order to track this trend. We found in our pilot that 10% of companies are making this investment, and we're interested to see how that will change through the years. So the longest of the criteria is the requirement that it must exist for a charitable purpose. This criteria is using the International Classification of Nonprofit Organizations, the ICNPO, which is a standard used by the United Nations, to define which categories are included or excluded within the Global Guide definition. On this side, you can see that we have all of the included categories. They have examples. The examples are not exhaustive, so these are just to provide some added definition and color to what will be included within these categories. And I would imagine that these categories would not surprise you. These are fairly intuitive and make sense and align typically with the primary categories within each country that we studied. We did have to exclude some of the categories from the ICNPO because through our research and through our public comments, we found that there was not significant momentum among the corporate contributions field to include them. It's political parties, professional associations, and religious institutions. An important exception is that an organization which has a charitable purpose but might have a religious foundation is included. So an example of this would be a homeless shelter run by a synagogue, or a pre-K program for low-income students run by a church. Because the funding is supporting a charitable purpose, we would not exclude that just because the institution itself has a religious orientation. So what is the difference compared to how we have collected data in the past? We're going to go here to what we found through a standard defining what is included within the key categories of foundations and associations in France, to find a similar list as we have in the US of what could be considered a charitable activity, or in this case, for the general interest. And here the list: general, philanthropic, educational, scientific, social, humanitarian. I mean, these are all fairly aligned with the global guide. However, we know that in practical fact in France, and every organization which applies for general interest status for their association would need to make the connection to one of these categories. And what we're seeking is to move away from a nationally defined regulation. Another way that it's different is we are citing the Journal Officiel of France, where organizations are listed if they are a qualified charitable organization. Once again, we're seeking to take a step back from any national definition or regulation to allow us to step into a new era where we can report on giving across borders with criteria which do not rely on a domestic standard. So the difference is that we're not looking to a national regulation anymore, but we're using a charitable purpose categorization, which you saw on the slide of included categories. And this is really will become the baseline. I mean, certain categories from the general interest status could be excluded. France is the one that I've seen where the language is included in qualified categories. Family is another specification which could be unique. When we go to the included categories and the examples there, we can see where certain things may fall and be included. So it's not a direct category to category or activity to activity comparison. We don't want to think of it that way. But it could be that there are certain organizations which might qualify would no longer be included under the global guide. More importantly is what's the same. In the same way that using a registered charity as the baseline or the definition for including grantees or recipients, we do think that the ICNPO is an excellent external and credible taxonomy to use. This allows us to use something which is created at the level of a standard required by the United Nations. We also think that it is highly aligned. Although the criteria are stepping away from using national regulation, we think that they should cover the vast majority of the partners that companies have, whether it's in health, education, human services, culture and arts, environment. Government-run schools are a commonly accepted inclusion within charitable or philanthropy budgets. And the exclusion of government institutions is also standard from what we have found in our looks across the country in our research and through our practitioner engagement process. So applying the criteria, we're asking companies then to think through how do you see these criteria within your policies and procedures. As I mentioned, the first criteria is indefinite in most cases, if not all cases. The charitable categories, perhaps you have a field within your tracking system where you're looking at a program area or type to capture that, and you'd be able to easily look and sort to see what would be included or excluded based off of the global guide. And we always seek each year an improvement in quality. It's something that happens with our current standard, the corporate giving standard to produce giving in numbers, and something we know will happen with the global guide as well. Each year reporting can improve, and then that's better for not only external efforts like CECP or Admical for benchmarking, but internally as well. And we'll just reinforce the fact that we really see the intention of this as a benchmarking effort. the data that CECP has is really always the company's data. It's not our data, and it's something that we only seek to use for the purposes that you can help advance your internal purposes and activities that you're dedicated to. So benchmarking, what that looks like for CECP is that we produce the annual summary, which I'll give you a snapshot of in a minute. And we'd like to, if we have an adequate sample from France, to be able to create a side-by-side comparison, which we'll send to Admical to share with all of you who participate, to show, compared to the global sample, how do French companies measure up. And we can see what the differences in unique categories and characterizations might be. And it goes beyond that to see sort of the high level, what is total giving, what is the breakdown. And this is kind of a first point of entry. The main way CECP hears companies using this is in things like their foundation board meeting or their annual board of directors meeting to provide context for individuals who might not be thinking about corporate responsibility all day to understand what the company's performance looks like compared to others. Collaboration, we make connections to companies because of those that participate. We can identify who might be a good company to have a phone meeting with. Leadership, obviously our pilot was our first foray, and this is our second year, and participating in the Global Guide is establishing your company as a leader in dedication to global measurement. You will be in good company, meaning that we do set some limits on the size of companies that participate in the effort, and that is in order to create benchmarking which is most useful. You need a comparable size company in order to ensure that the benchmarking is meaningful for you. Recognition is important. We certainly want to share the names of companies both online and in our print materials as our participants. And this is also important because so many other rankings, and there's a huge push for transparency, and we certainly want you to be recognized for participating in this. And internal consensus, we've heard that many companies are using the Global Guide standard as a consensus builder to inspire a meeting with different departments and different business units around total giving and why it's important to start giving abroad. And we hope that that's kind of an additional benefit beyond whether or not you participate in the actual study or not. This is a quick view of our pilot. You can see that because we have our U.S. foundation, that slice is big, but it's actually shrinking compared to our global or to our corporate giving standards study, and hopefully will shrink again this year as we expand internationally and bring in new companies to our Global Guide study. This is a light touch on what our benchmarking looks like within our Global Guide study. You can see the median for the sample on 2011 giving was US 39 million, with the breakdown between direct and product or non-cash giving and the foundation cash. It's quite significant, the amount of funds moving to international end recipients among this sample. It's 44%, that's nearly half, and something that is quite different than what we found in our sample and our other standards through the corporate giving standard, and we'd love to see how this changes through the years as more companies from more countries are becoming involved. This is from our corporate giving standard data. This is just international givers, and primarily then U.S. headquartered companies are represented here, and it's 21% of their total giving portfolio. So we like to do our benchmarking broken down by industry, so you can find your company's industry and see how you compare, and use this as a point of reference among other presentations that you might be doing internally. At our summit, we always do some live audience polling. It's always good to get a sense of what's happening in the room. And this is a question we asked about the strongest driver of international giving. We found that the business or company strategy was actually the key driver. We think this is quite significant because we know employee footprint is a major factor in driving it, but we also think that international giving is becoming even more strategic, and it could be following a company's international expansion in other ways or even leading in some cases. So it's something that every company should have on its radar and consider how to become better at tracking and benchmarking on it. So I wanted to take a quick view. I'm just going to pause my screen here so that I can show you in our online system what it looks like to submit information to the Global Guide. On our website, you can log in at my CECP, and I would provide a login for you. you would click on Corporate Giving Standard in order to enter in the system. And then once you click on that, you'll be on this main homepage. I'm in a test case, Company A. And you'll click on Global Guide Data, which will then bring you into the online system itself where you can enter the information. So total contributions is the key question, and you'll be reporting this against the Global Guide Standard. When you click on Answer Question, the system becomes live, and you can enter in the direct, the foundation, and the non-cash figures. You can either submit, you can cancel, or you can save your response. Submit lets us know that you're finished and that we can access your data. Country data is the second question. If you don't have a country breakdown, you can enter the balance into breakdown not available, and then just put the total given domestically in the field for France. And this allows us to assess what's going internationally and what's being done domestically. So breakdown not available is a field. And also if you don't have your total portfolio on a country basis, you can use breakdown not available for the balance. And the final question is tracking trends. This is what we mentioned, that there's two categories excluded from total contributions, but still something we know that a minority of companies are giving to, and we want to track this information. That's to government institutions, except for schools, and also to for-profit businesses, primarily social enterprises. And what's important here is there's an important difference between NA, or non-applicable, and 0. NA means that you do not give in that category at all, and 0 means that you do give in that category, but you may not have in the past year. And this helps us track whether or not a company is giving in the area or not. So those are the three questions. It's very short, it's concise, and this is our intention in order to make it easily accessible for companies to become involved in our early days with the Global Guide. And that's the conclusion of the presentation. The deadline is July 15th, and you can contact me for further information on submitting to the study. And we'd like to thank Laura and Admical for helping us convene this webinar, and hope that the information was useful in clarifying what the Global Guide criteria cover.
Thank you very much, Carmen.
So we'll make the webinar available, the recording available